Today, I wanted to talk about the Summer Games Fest and all of the conferences that happened this weekend and kind of look at things in a little bit more depth than some of the other YouTube videos out there and really kind of try to analyze, why the Games Fest kind of has been received the way it's been received, which I think for a lot of people has been very negative. I don't really think that there's been a ton of games that really piqued my interest. And really, I wanted to kind of try to analyze this and look at this in a little bit more depth than just saying that all these games are slop, they suck, and just try to like really dive into the reasons why that's the case, and what we can kind of expect and how to think about this just moving forward. So I think there's a couple of ways you can break this down, but I think that the most important thing to look at is the financial dynamics that we see happening in the video game industry, and one of those things that's really prevalent is the long development cycles that we see with so many video games. I mean, the time it takes to create sequels or just a new game in general is taking years upon years. I mean, we're talking like 5, 7 years. And we see this with a lot of games that are coming out and it just takes forever. And I think that when you look at these video game conferences, you have these games that are released, or at least they're presented at these showcases, and they don't come out for another year or 2 years or even 3 or 4 years. I mean, even in the case of Xbox, which I think that they probably had the best conference of the bunch, think about all the games that have been announced in the past and they were nowhere to be found. So there's Perfect Dark, there's Fable, you have the Gears of War game, Elder Scrolls 6, Forza, Halo. Some of these haven't been announced, but you have all these series that have been in development for a long time, or there hasn't been a game in a long time. And this long development cycle, I think, leads to a kind of situation where some of these kind of big hitters, these huge games, don't really show up in these game showcases as much as they did in the past. Where if you look at the sequel for some of the older games in like the Assassin's Creed franchise, Grand Theft Auto, Halo, what have you, it's a lot shorter of a time frame. And so when you look at this, that is definitely affecting how good these conferences are in general. But it's more than just the long game development cycle. It is the high cost of video game development that we see, at least from a lot of these AAA games where the budgets are huge. I mean, they cost $50 million, $100 million, what have you. And this is really kind of creating this new dynamic within the video game industry where if you have a really big budget, you have to capture a really big market share to have your game be profitable. You have to earn enough revenue to kind of make it worth it. And the only way to do that is to try to make the game as mass appealable as possible, right? Because if you have a $50 million budget, $100 million budget, it's hard to make a niche game. It's safer to try to appeal to the broader market audience. And a lot of times what ends up happening is gameplay mechanics get watered down. And that kind of leads to a lower quality of a lot of video games. But it's more than that. I think you see a lot of safety in game design because there is definitely more money in video games. And in the end of the day, these companies are trying to earn a profit and they're trying to get as much profit as possible. And in the most kind of risk averse way you possibly can achieve that in. And so you see this with so many games out there. You see this with the huge amounts of remasters, remakes, sequels. I mean, just to name a few, like you have the Tony Hawk remasters, right? 3 and 4, which I think the first two were pretty well received, but it's very obvious that if that does well, they'll probably remaster Underground 1 and Underground 2 and then the American Wasteland games. You also have Resident Evil, like the 9th game in the series. So I'm sure that's great. I'm not a big horror fan. You have another Resident Evil game. You have a Gears of War kind of trilogy kind of bundle, which to me, that actually is the company trying to be safe because you're basically reselling a game that's already been made. You're just brushing it up. So your cost of development is pretty low. And then you're building hype for the next Gears of War game. So when you look at it from that perspective, it actually makes total financial sense because you are basically trying to make Gears of War more relevant again. And you're trying to also resell a product that was made like 20 years ago. So there's that. We have Call of Duty. Okay, that's pretty self-explanatory. We have Final Fantasy Tactics Remastered, which is cool, but it's an old game. We have the Final Fantasy VII Remake coming to Game Pass and Xbox, which is cool. But basically, you see a lot of games that are just trying to build on this kind of safety. Another game I noticed, Persona 4 Remake, which Atlas is just famous for this, where they will just cash in on the series again and again, where there's a gazillion Persona 5 spin-offs. Then you had Persona 3 remake, and then now you're having Persona 4 remake. And honestly, if there's a Persona 4 remake coming, then Persona 6 is probably a long ways off. And I wouldn't be surprised if they tried to remake Persona 1 and the two Persona 2 games, and then at a later point try to make them 3D. So, there's a lot of this safety that's going into these dynamics, which I think is affecting the overall quality of the product. Because you have to remember, in the end of the day, like, video games are an artistic endeavor. And because they're an artistic endeavor, there's a level of risk to that. But I think that because video games have shown to be so profitable, there's so much money in video games now that a lot of businesses have really tried to maximize their profits and try to maximize profits while taking as little risk as possible. And you achieve that through sequels. You achieve that through selling remasters, remakes, where you kind of negate some of that creative process, right? The story's already written, the gameplay is already there, you kind of brush it up and you resell it, you repackage it, or the IP is established, it's relatively popular. But those other dynamics, the long game development cycle, the high cost of development, I think all those things are definitely affecting things. But you also see this like trend of popular genres popping up again and again. And I think that this is kind of a chasing of the trends, where you see this with a lot of the games that were kind of released. So, you saw a lot of Souls-like games. I mean, a lot of Souls-like games, a good amount of horror games. You saw a lot of these kind of battle royale-esque shooters, which to me, that's kind of trying to shoot for the moon in a sense, where you want to be that next popular battle royale game. You want to be that next popular multiplayer game, because there's a huge opportunity there to sell microtransactions, to sell ancillary revenue. But it's kind of a make it or break it situation, where if the game does not retain players, the game just ends. So I think there's been a lot of games that are trying to capitalize on that, but I don't know if they have that appeal. And really, there's probably only so much space in the market for so many of those types of games, like a Counter-Strike, a League of Legends, something like that. So I think those financial dynamics are definitely happening, but it's something that's affecting the overall quality of these conferences. But the other thing too is I feel like the game format is really not conducive. So if you ever watched the old E3 conferences, things were a little bit different. I think that they were kind of more akin to what Xbox did in their conference, where it was just kind of a presentation. There was not a lot of this kind of like theater aspect, this kind of cringy millennial humor stuff. And it was more about the games. And so I remember you could see like in the GameSpot's live coverage of the old E3 events, you'd have these presentations and conferences, but then GameSpot or IGN or whoever would have these booths set up where game developers would come and showcase their game in like these 30-minute slots. So you'd have a game where, maybe it got a quick trailer in the conference for one of the studios or like PlayStation or Xbox, and then they got a chance to show some of the game. They got a chance to ask questions from the audience or ask questions from the interviewers. And I think that gave people a little bit more of a perspective on what that game was. These games got a little bit more time, and it was because E3 was a trade show. So the dynamic was a lot, I think, more conducive to showing off games than a 2-hour video, a 1-hour video where you have to cram all these things in and it just doesn't work. I mean, this is really especially true for a lot of these indie games where you see like a 5 or 10-second blurb and the game might be good, but it's really hard to know if the game is good from a 5 or 10-second blurb. And some games just kind of don't lend themselves to that kind of marketing or that kind of showcase. And I think that that old E3 format where you had each of these games kind of have a little bit more time in the sun, or it was just kind of presented in a little bit of a different way, I think was helpful to kind of making the conference a little bit more enjoyable. It was kind of showcasing a lot more games in a little bit of a different light. But the thing about it too is we have to also ask ourselves the question that what really is new here? I mean, what really is new? I mean, when I look at a lot of the games that have been announced with Summer Games Fest or the Xbox Showcase, the PC Gaming Showcase, the PlayStation one, there's really not a lot new here. I mean, there's not a ton of innovation. You see, like as I mentioned earlier, you see a lot of Souls-like games where I feel like some of them are okay, but they're like Souls games without the soul of Dark Souls. They look okay, and some of them are better than others, but or look better than others, but it seems like it's chasing a trend. Saw a lot of horror games too. I think some of those are maybe okay. Like I said, I'm not a big horror game person, and you see a ton of this third person action genre where it's like God of War or Last of Us style, and it's like an 8 hour, 10 hour experience where you're walking through a corridor and you have kind of serviceable combat, and it's almost like I guess a movie game. You also see a lot of movie game like games at these conferences. But the problem with these movie games is you have like a script that's realistically 2 hours, a story that's 2 hours that's stretched to 10 or 12 hours. And the gameplay is serviceable and there's nothing really interesting there. And then even then, the story is relatively safe probably. And there's nothing really new. There's really nothing there that's kind of just catching you from a story perspective. And I think it's really hard to pull that off. I mean, God of War did that, but they had the previous God of War games from the PlayStation 2 era. You know, Last of Us was one of the first games to kind of really pull that off in a very cinematic experience. So I think it's really hard to pull those games off, but you see so many of them. I mean, it just seems like there's just Souls games and movie games and these kind of third person action slashing games, which that's fine, but I think people want more than that. It's just a little bit stale. And to me, it seems like, once again, it ties back to that financial dynamic. It ties back into that idea of let's try to earn a safe return on our investment, chase these established trends, and kind of go from there. And you kind of see this too with just some of the other showcases too, like the PC gaming showcase. It's just very weak. I mean, it's always kind of been very weak. And I think that's just because if you're like a big game, a huge studio, you're going to be at the Xbox showcase, the PlayStation showcase, the Summer Games Fest showcase. And so a lot of the kind of more indie games, stuff like that, it's kind of shown on the PC gaming showcase. And it kind of just feels a little weak. And some of those trailers are just not very long. And so you don't really get a perspective on some of those games. Like I said, I think some of them are probably okay, but it's just really hard to get a sense of it from a 10-second trailer that's kind of presented to you very quickly. So I think that's very tough. But once again, with all these things, where's the innovation? Is there some new gameplay genre? Is there new gameplay mechanics? Is there kind of this new story idea, this kind of very immersive story? I think there's a couple of examples of this, but in so many cases, there's just nothing new here. It's the same stuff that's been rehashed and again, and a lot of it's sequels, the same IP, and that gets kind of boring after a while. But I think that when you just kind of look at this overall, the super kind of long development cycles really just, I think, hurt some of these conferences. The financial dynamics are just a element that's affecting the video game industry that kind of goes well beyond the scope of just the video game conferences in of itself. I think it's a bigger and broader issue. But that creative risk thing too is just a huge problem as well. I mean, I think you see a lot of game developers where I feel like it's almost like the game is made by committee. It's not a game that there's like this passion, there's like a soul to it. I know that's kind of like a overused term, but some of these games seem to lack an factor. They lack this soul, they lack this energy. And there's a couple of games that are presented and you kind of feel it. You kind of feel this energy, but a lot of these games just feel like they were developed in a corporate boardroom. And I don't know. I think that part of that is that there's people that have kind of risen in the upper echelons of the video game industry that have kind of taken hold and their visions are being kind of put forward. And some of them are just really not that good. And then the last thing is, are these games going to be good? I mean, just because you have a flashy trailer does not mean that this game or any of these games are going to be good. I mean, one game I remember in particular is the Order 1886, where that game looked really cool back in the day. And then it turned out to be like a 2 or 3 hour experience and very disappointing. Or there was that other game, I can't really remember what it was called. There was a Dead Space like game that came out like a year or two ago. Same idea where it just kind of was a little disappointing. And so I think there's a lot of fatigue and there's a lot of skepticism with these just kind of video games in general, but also these shows. I mean, there seems to be this lack of relatability to the average person that plays video games with these game show hosts and the people presenting in these conferences. I mean, it has this very corporate feel and this feel of the people presenting are just industry voice actors and executives that really don't play video games. They're not the person that's playing Valheim with you at 1 a.m. on the weekend or Counter-Strike or whatever. So I feel like there's a disconnect, and these video game conferences kind of have that corporate feel. They have that just feeling that just seems very synthetic. It's not natural. And I think that all these like factors are contributing to the negative reception for a lot of people about these conferences. Now, I think there's a couple of gems here and there, but like I said, broadly speaking, I wasn't too impressed. I mean, some of these games are kind of interesting. Like I thought Ahoy was very interesting. Clockwork Revolution was cool. Chronicles Medieval, but a lot of these games, maybe you would try them at a later date when they were discounted on Steam. But like, are they a day one purchase? I don't know. I mean, I think some of these games people would definitely try at a later date, but playing day one, spending $60 or $80 in the case of the Outer Worlds, which I thought was really aggressive, to be honest with you, because I didn't really think the first Outer Worlds was really that good. And I'm kind of surprised to hear that they're charging $80 for that game. I mean, that's a steep price, but you know, it very well could be that that's just a way to get people on to Game Pass more than anything. So I think that some of these games could be good, but are they day one purchases? You know, maybe not, probably not for a lot of people. And so many people have like a huge backlog, especially on Steam, where you don't really need to go out and purchase some of these games, especially if they're a 7 or 8 out of 10, when there's so many masterpieces and other games that you could play. So these are my thoughts on the overall conferences that happened this weekend. I think that, like I said, it was very disappointing. And I just think there wasn't too much there that was super groundbreaking or exciting, even though there are some gems in there and a couple games that are probably worth playing maybe at some point. But what do you think? Let me know, and I'll see you in the next one.